Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh and I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Environment and Energy. Just a little bit about NQA. We're one of the UK's major certification bodies represented in locations across the world. And we work with clients both locally and globally, and we tailor our approach particularly to suit each client. So today's webinar, just to make sure you're in the right place, is going to look at the newly issued ISO 50001-2018 standard. I'm hoping to talk for about 45 minutes. That could increase because those of you that have met me before, and hello to those people who are tuning in who've met me before, welcome. And of course, a welcome to those people who haven't met me before. But you'll quickly realise that I sometimes like the sound of my own voice. And whilst I say I'm going to talk for 45 minutes, that could go on. Couple of bits on housekeeping. First of all, if anybody has any questions as we're going through, if I can, I'll try and answer them as we go along, if it's pertinent to do so at the time. If not, I'll save them to the end. You will get a copy of the presentation emailed to you within the next few days. I've been told they'll be going out tomorrow, so fingers crossed on that one. You'll get it in PDF format. And also, we are recording this webinar, and for those of you familiar with YouTube, if you look for NQA's YouTube channel, you'll find, probably again tomorrow, a recording of this presentation. So any questions into the chat box that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. So what are we going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at the new standard, of course. We're going to be looking at one or two of the new concepts that are in there that probably should be familiar to quite a few of you now, because there is an awful lot of familiarity about the new standard. We're going to look at the clauses, of course. That's the main reason for this webinar. We're going to look at the transition process and also some little tips from myself, and then hopefully at the end a question and answer session. So what are we going to do then? We're going to be looking at what the key concepts are of 50001, some new terminology and definitions that have been introduced in 50001-2018, obviously the specific new clauses, requirements, and importantly, I think, evidence that we as assessors would be looking for when we come to carry out the certification or the transition visits, transition timelines and some notable dates, and then some practical tips towards the end. So one or two overarching concepts. Intended outcomes, that's a phrase that appears now in all of these newly revised standards, be it 9001-14, the newly issued 45001. They all have an intended outcome, and the intended outcomes are not too dissimilar. You could probably almost just substitute the particular aim of the standard in there, be it energy, be it environment, or be it quality. So of course, no surprise, the intended outcome for ISO 50001 is continual improvement in energy performance. And that phrase continual improvement is particularly important, as we shall see a little bit later on in the presentation. Also, fulfillment of compliance obligations, that's the term that's generally used. As we shall see, that's not used in the new standard. More about that later. And also the achievement of environmental and energy objectives. So those are overarching concepts across all of the new standards, and then also introduced through the newer format, focusing on the planning process, management of risk, and particularly allowing the standard to integrate with other standards within businesses and also other business processes. So where did 50001 come from? And energy management standards have been around for some while, obviously not as long as environmental standards. Started out in the early 2000s with the standards that you can see there. The first major standard that we within NQA and I as an assessor worked on was BS or ENB, BSEN 16001, 2009, and that was really the first formal management system and energy management system in the format that we see now. That was pretty quickly superseded in 2011 by ISO 50001, and because standards tend to be revised every 5 or 6 years, sometimes a bit longer than that, but usually every 5 or 6 years, we're now at the first revision of ISO 50001. And that is basically where 50001 sits at the moment. We are right in the middle of 2018, or perhaps 2/3 of the way through now, but the standard itself was issued on the 20th of August this year. As you can see, excuse me, as you can see, the original standard was issued in 2011. The draft came out last year, and in this year, 20th of August 2018, the new standard was published, ISO 50001 2018. As with the other standards, 9 and 14, there is a transition period, and that transition period, as was expected, lasts for 3 years. And any existing certificates to the 50001 2011 standard, if you haven't transitioned within the 3-year period, your certificates will expire on the 19th of August 2021. If we do any recertification visits now, obviously most people will not be ready to transition just at the moment, but if we did a recertification visit, say next month in October, you would not now get a 3-year certificate. All expiry dates for the existing 2011 standard will now expire on the 19th of August 2021. We will, as you see, be starting to run training programs. This is the first webinar that we've delivered, and there will be training materials and other similar webinars running over the next couple of years. Obviously, to ease you through the process, we're also running extensive staff training sessions as well. So why did it change? Same reason that all the other standards really changed, to remain relevant to industry and other organisations, provide a consistent foundation across all of the standards for the next 10 years or so, reflect the increasingly complex environments in which we all operate now, where energy and environmental management, environmental stewardship is very high on the agenda, to try and give a slightly different focus to a lot of these standards. There's always been a criticism that the standards work well if you're a manufacturing organisation, less so if you're in the service sector. This is another thing that people have tried to achieve as the standard has been rewritten. The new leadership clauses allow a greater emphasis or greater focus on corporate governance. But I think most of all, there's been a push from industry for easier integration of the management systems. If we jump back in time to before the 2015 versions of 9 and 14,001 were issued, you would find that the clauses in 9001 didn't align with the clauses in 14. The clauses in 14 did align with the clauses of 50, but again, there were differences. So they've all tried to work to the same standard and the same framework, if you like, and that framework, which came out 7 or 8 years possibly ago now, is called Annex SL. Doesn't matter about that, that's what it's called, and if anybody mentions Annex SL, it's simply a framework. You'll see on the slide there's a big but. Sadly, the revised standard for 50,001 has somewhat drifted away from some of the terms and clauses used in 14,001. Don't understand why. It's not really helpful, is what they've done, if you already have 14,001 2015. But as far as I'm concerned, as far as NQA are concerned, and as far as our assessors will be concerned, if you choose to use the same structure for 14 that you have in place for 14, for 50, that will not cause any problems or any issues. There are some changes in terminology that have happened in 14 but haven't happened in 50, and we'll highlight those as we go through. So that's the Annex SL format. If you've already got 9001 or 14,001 2015, that will look very, very familiar to you. If you haven't and you've got a standalone 50,001 system currently, that might appear to be new. And clauses 4 to 10 are the auditable clauses, and those are the clauses that we will be concentrating on. As with all of these standards, they follow what's known as the Deming cycle for those of you that are quality experts. Simply, that is the plan, do, check, act. This is actually cut from the standard itself, and that just shows how the clauses within the standard, planning, support and operation, performance evaluation, improvement, fit in with the plan, do, check, act. One or two of you might be familiar with this slide. It's a slide I tend to use. Maybe I'm slightly different, I don't know. I tend to like things linear. I can visualize them better, and that's the same thing but set out in a linear structure with the non-auditable clauses 1, 2, 3, scope, normative references and terms and definitions set outside, and then clauses 4 to 9 across the top with all the various sub-clauses shown below. Of course, the whole purpose of this is to allow it to easily integrate, and obviously it does share very, very similar structures with 9, 14, 45,000 and 50,000. So obviously you only need one central core structure if you're going for a fully integrated management system. So how does it fit in with 14? Because those are the two, or these are the two standards that probably sit closest together, both in aims and activities and what they're setting out to achieve. And I know one or two, or quite a few of my clients run the two hand in hand. So obviously 50,001 focuses on energy performance, while 14,001 addresses all the significant environmental impacts of an organisation. Both of the standards can be implemented individually, or you can integrate them together, and also, as we've seen, integrate with any of the other ISO management standards. What we tend to say is that if energy is an organisation's most significant impact, then maybe 50,001 might actually be the more appropriate standard, but obviously the two work very, very closely together. And at the end of the day, what it's doing, it's taking energy management from just being one of the impacts within an organisation into something that's specifically managed and that takes that management to a much higher level. Just a couple of explanations for some of the terms and expressions used. Obviously, it now uses the standard uses the term correction, which is an action to eliminate a detected non-conformity. The term corrective action is used as action to eliminate the cause of a detected non-conformity. The term preventive action has been dropped from the standard as a specific clause, as a reference, and it's now deemed that clause 6, which is all about the planning clause, that now is actually the preventive action, which is trying to stop things going wrong, stop things happening in the first place. And then a very important one, energy performance. Obviously, the intended outcome of this standard is improvement in energy performance. If we're going to improve it, we need to know what it is. So it's defined as measurable results related to energy efficiency, use, and consumption. Right, so that's sort of an introduction. That's where we are. And the bulk of this presentation comes next, which is a walk through the clauses within the new standard. Now, at the moment, nobody's asked any questions, which is good from my perspective, because I'm assuming that either you can't hear me, which I'm sure you can, or I've covered everything that everybody was expecting at the moment. So just a reminder, if you do want to ask any questions as we go along, type them in the chat box, please. Right, so one of the requirements of the new structure, the Annex SL structure, the first clause within the standard is the context of the organisation. And the context of the organisation is really all about determining the external and internal issues that are relevant to what you do and that affect your ability to achieve the intended outcomes of your management system. We know what the intended outcomes are. That's improvement in energy performance. So in other words, what this clause is asking you to think about is what's going to help you and what's going to get in the way. So the positives, the negatives, risks, opportunities, call them what you will. It's as simple as you need to achieve something, what's going to help you, what's going to get in the way, and that's what you need to think about. So the requirement of the standard, the requirement of the clause is to consider your context, consider what you do, and also to move on and think about, which the next slide will fill us in on, the needs of those people who have an interest in what you do and their requirements. Now, one of the things that we will look at, one of the big changes, is to do with legislation. And legislation now comes into this very early clause. So we'll cover that in a couple of slides' time. So if you do all of this, if you understand the context of your organization, understand where you are, where you're going, what you're trying to achieve, what's going to help you, what's going to hinder you, you should have ticked off this first clause. The standard doesn't require it to be documented. The standard says there has to be a high level understanding of the issues. Now, if you've already got 14 or 9,001 in place, then this clause really will almost already be there. All you'll need to do is just tweak it a little bit to make sure that you've included specific energy considerations. Not going to go through this slide particularly, it's just there as a reminder. These are the sorts of things that you might like to think about when you're looking specifically at this clause from an energy perspective. And as I've said, remember, the intent is to provide a high-level conceptual understanding. So this is something that needs to be understood at the highest level within the organisation. So when we come to the leadership clause, and as part of the leadership clause, we as assessors will be speaking to whoever is considered to be the top management within your business, usually the MD. We will be expecting that person to have an understanding of the potential issues that are identified at this level. Okay, so one of the big issues that I have had with the new standard, and rather disappointingly, when the standard came out as a draft, I fed this back in to the committee and was totally ignored. It shows how much notice they take of people. One of the things I fed back in was that ISO 14001 has a separate clause, clause 6.1.3, called compliance obligations, and it sat there under the planning clause. Now, that sort of ties in with the Annex SL way of managing things. ISO 50001 has chosen not to go down that route and does not have a clause called compliance obligations. Rather more annoyingly, it's not used the term compliance obligations, which the new standards tend to use, and is stuck with the old terminology, which is legal and other requirements. Bit annoying, but never mind. We have to work with what we've got. So there isn't a clause called compliance obligations. Your legal requirements and your understanding of legislation and other requirements, that's non-legal requirements, commitments that you've maybe made, all come under this interested parties section. So there isn't a specific section. However, if you're already running a 14001 system and you have a legal register that includes energy and you call them compliance obligations, not a problem. The standard says you can call things whatever you like. So if you're already running a 14001 system, have a legal register that includes energy, and you call everything compliance obligations, stick with it. Nobody will ask you to change. It's just a little bit confusing that the standard set out to work to this set format and then immediately they've drifted away from it. So as an absolute minimum within the requirements of relevant interested parties, you can choose which ones you choose to comply with the exception, obviously, of relevant legal requirements, and they have to be included and reviewed at defined intervals set by yourself. And you need to ensure that all of the things, all of the commitments that you decide to make, all of the pieces of legislation that you are compelled to comply with, all of these have been taken into account within your management system. Your management system acknowledges them and sets up control processes to ensure that you're delivering what you're supposed to be delivering or not doing what you're not supposed to do. So you can choose which of these you wish to meet with the exception of the legislative requirements. Again, interested parties, quick slide just to give you an idea. Again, you'll have seen this a million times. Most management systems already ask you to do this, and again, you've got the same information on there. So I've already spotted a slight mistake on this slide. I'm not used to typing EMS, that I forget to type ENMS sometimes. So 4.3 should say the scope of the ENMS, which is an energy management system as opposed to environmental management system. Basically, the requirements are the same. You can select part of the organisation for certification, and we have a number of clients where that happens, both in environment and within energy, that the certification doesn't cover everything. However, the standard clarifies this requirement a little bit. If you only include part of the organisation, you must include within the relevant bits all of the energy types used by the organisation. So for instance, if you have one part of the organisation, as an extreme example, that still uses coal, you can't draw a line around that and say, well, we'll do all the bits that are using clean energy, but actually we'll ignore the coal bits because coal is one of the energy types that you're using. So if you're going to draw a line around any of the boundaries, you can't use that line to exclude a particular energy type. You must have authority to control the energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption within the scope. That sometimes causes problems with some of the clients I've worked with, maybe large clients with a number of multi-sites that maybe have smaller sites. Sometimes where those sites are in rented accommodation, leased accommodation, the energy efficiency might not be very controllable, and in some cases, some of the companies I work with, the only option they have is to turn things on or off and maybe have some influence in the temperature that the air conditioning or heating is set at. But still, there is a degree of control. Another of the issues comes in there that sometimes these areas have an all-inclusive tariff, if you like, for the building. So you pay rental and the energy that you use is included, and it's not always easy to get an exact figure because there's no submetering for the floor that you're on. So again, if that's the case, we'll talk about that with you on a one-to-one basis. We'll talk about that as part of the assessment process. It's not new, it's something we've come across quite regularly. One final point, not going to go into what ESOS is. It stands for Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. I'm not going to go into any details about what it's all about. However, one of the ways of complying is to be registered to ISO 50001. If you're going to do that and you're only using the scope of your ENMS to cover part of the organisation, that part of the organisation has to include at least 90% of your total energy use. That's only if you're drawing a line around part of the organisation and using it for ESOS compliance purposes. Yet again, I should have proofread this a little bit better before I used it, but never mind. 4.4, energy management system, just basically tells you what you've got to have. You've got to have a system that's established, implemented, maintained, and a system that continually improves to achieve the intended outcome. It says that you've got to ensure that your processes are controlled, that you carry them out as you meant to carry them out, and they achieve what they meant to achieve. They achieve the desired results. We have to define how processes interact. It's a little bit like the 9001 clause. We have to say how clauses interact with each other, and we have to try and ensure that we integrate our energy management system into our wider business processes, whether they're design and development, procurement, as we'll see later on, HR, sales, marketing, production, whatever. And then finally, when we are, if we're starting out from scratch, developing an energy management system, we also consider the knowledge gained from 4.1 and 4.2, which is the context and needs of interested parties. We need to take the knowledge that we've gained from that in the development of our system. A clause that's new to you, if you have only got 50,001, if you've got the other standards, you'll be more than familiar with this. Leadership and commitment. The old standards just talked about senior management commitment. We're now talking about leadership. Leadership is all about walking the walk and not just talking the talk. We expect a demonstrable level of leadership to be seen, and we will, as part of the transition process, want to speak to your managing director or whatever that person at the highest level is called. Their role is, as shown on the slide, to make sure that it's not just a standalone system that's managed in isolation, that the energy management system is involved and considered when decisions are being made. I've been into so many businesses, both on environment and energy, where the energy manager or the energy management team are the last ones to know and don't always get involved in some of the decisions that are being made. Now, this again is what the standard's saying we have to do. We have to make sure that the requirements and the outputs and the expectations from our energy management system are aligned with the wider business objectives. We need to make sure, and I've pinched this slightly from another clause, but I think it fits better in here, we have to make sure that we are providing the appropriate level of resources. Now that's actually clause 7.1, but I've covered it in here because usually the resources are provided ultimately by the top management. Make sure that the system receives the appropriate involvement from across the business. Everybody has to be involved. It's not just something that you as an energy manager or part of an energy management team can do in isolation. We expect the senior management of an organisation to promote continual improvement, to promote energy efficiency, and to promote the use and involvement of everybody within the energy management system. And an interesting one now, to ensure that the performance indicators that are chosen appropriately represent energy performance. Now again, these are the things that we are expected of the leader of the organisation, and the standard asks that they do. And when we talk to the leaders, we would expect them to be able to be knowledgeable and demonstrate that knowledge over those requirements. So top management is now defined as the person or group of people who direct and control an organisation at the highest level. That's what the standard says. That's what it is. It's the same across all the other standards. So in an organisation with a company-wide ENMS, top management's really the board. If, for example, the energy management system has only been employed at, say, one location within a group of companies, top management would be the top manager, the senior person within that one business unit. So if it's just in an individual factory, maybe it would be the person who actually manages hands-on that factory, not the person that sits 100 miles away in head office. And ultimately, the new standard requires top management to take accountability for the effectiveness of the system. The buck stops with them. So the policy. You can see there's a theme going through here with some of these slides. I need to go back and address that. This is the first time I've delivered this webinar, by the way, so hopefully there's an excuse, and I will amend them before we send the presentation out to you. So the energy policy, some fairly specific requirements as opposed to what you might see in an environmental policy. So it has to be appropriate to what you do. You can't just pinch somebody else's and copy and paste that in. It's got to have a framework for setting and reviewing energy objectives. You've got to commit in the policy to making available the necessary information and resources to achieve objectives and energy targets. And note that word target. That's another issue I have with the standard and Annex SL. This standards retain the word target. You've got to commit to satisfy applicable legal requirements and other requirements. Now, if you wish to use the term compliance obligations, as far as I'm concerned, as far as we'll be concerned, that is acceptable because it's the principle we're talking about. So if you have a combined energy and environmental policy that meets the requirements of 14,001 2015, I wouldn't be expecting you to change compliance obligations for legal requirements. We know what you mean. There has to be commitment to continual improvement of the system itself and continual improvement of energy performance. There has to be a support in there for the design and procurement for energy efficiency. The policy has to be documented and available to interested parties and, of course, communicated within the business. Roles, responsibilities, authorities, and as I say, I've pinched the term resources in here as well from clause 7. Quite interesting now, the requirement within the standard for an energy manager has been dropped. Now, I'm not suggesting that those of you tuning in, those of you listening in, that energy managers need to start looking for another job, far from it. But the standard now requires the use of an energy team. And a team, in my book, is more than one person. So therefore, we would expect to see a team of people managing energy within the business. The key roles haven't really changed, ensuring the system is established, implemented, maintained and continually improved. That phrase keeps cropping up, as you'll see. Ensuring it conforms to the requirements of the standard. The actions are implemented to continually improve energy performance. That underpins the whole standard, and if you don't achieve it, it'll get you into bother. I've spoken to that about a number of you that I can see who've tuned in, but we'll cover that towards the end. Report on the performance of the system and energy improvements to top management, and establish criteria and methods to make sure that the operation and control of the system is effective. Now the resources, this is a bit pinched from clause 7, but I think also the team would be the ones who would, having been given the resources, would then have responsibility to ensure that the resources that are there, that are used effectively, and those resources could be human resources, so people, infrastructure, might need bits of kit for measurement, technology, financial resources, and of course with everything else, above all, time. So moving on to clause 6, planning. So clause 6 is all about addressing the issues that you identified at the start in clauses 4.1. So this is the issues about what's going to help us and what's going to get in the way. We're now starting to think about how can we plan around those issues? How can we plan to maximize the things that are going to help us? How can we plan to minimize or mitigate the things that are going to get in the way? So it's all about planning to achieve the intended outcomes. And of course, as we've seen there, those are what the intended outcomes are. I mentioned them at the beginning, I mentioned them again. Continual improvement in energy performance, very, very important. Determine the risks and opportunities and to achieve your energy objectives and associated targets. It's all about preventing or reducing undesired effects, and spelling mistake on the bullet point there, external conditions affecting the organisation. So you need to take into account or try and reduce the effect of any external conditions. So they could be things like weather. Climate change, big issue at the moment, more extreme weather. That is going to have an effect on your energy usage. I suspect over the next few months, I'm going to be seeing a lot of people who've been jumping up and down worried because they've been throwing energy at their air conditioning system with the very warm summer that we've had. Not that I'm complaining about the weather. So it's all about planning to achieve continual improvement. And planning to address, as I've said, the risks and opportunities that we've identified. So we need to think about how we're going to implement these actions, how we're going to integrate them into the management system and our energy performance process, and make sure that we evaluate the effectiveness of them. Obviously, because it's an energy standard, not an environmental standard, there are no sections on aspects and impacts. So this is slightly different process now from the 14001 process. The standard does require that we set objectives and energy targets, and it uses that term deliberately, targets. The other standards don't. Now again, I'm not bothered. I have clients who use the term target in their environmental management systems, and I suspect I might have people who will have a 50,001 system that won't use the word target, but will talk about objectives and planning to achieve them. Both are quite correct. So it's a policy commitment. You've got to have them, and it's all about improving your management system and continually improving energy performance. And the objectives have to be consistent with the policy commitments. They've got to be measurable if you can. You've got to consider your SEUs. Now, this is the first of the 3-letter acronyms that we've thrown in. SEUs are significant energy users, and they're the closest thing that this standard has to your significant aspects and impacts. And it's the areas of the business, the processes, the pieces of kit, the machinery, call them however you wish to split them up. It's the areas of your business that use the most energy, and they become your significant energy users. So they need to be monitored, the objectives, you need to communicate and document them, and also they have to be updated. When you're planning for every objective, as you do with 14001, as you did with the old standard, for every objective there needs to be a plan. Who, what, when, so what we're going to do, what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, who's going to be involved, what resources are we going to need, how are we going to monitor how well we're doing? Because if we're on a journey, we need to know where we are at a set point in time. So how do we evaluate the results? What indicators are we using? ENPIs, we'll come on to those in a short while, and energy management performance indicators. And then we have to integrate the planned actions into our wider business processes. One of the requirements of the standard, which hasn't changed at all particularly, is the term energy review. It has to be done. The standard has clarified a number of points. The standard has pulled together some definitions and has helped I think, guide us through the process a little bit better, made things a little bit clearer. So basically, the process for an energy review is all about analysing your energy use and the consumption of that energy, where you're using it and how much are you using. So it's about identifying the current types of energy in use, identifying your past energy use and your current energy usage and consumption, and then based on that analysis, identify your significant energy uses. So in other words, as I've explained, what is it that we've got that's using the most energy? And for each of those significant energy uses, so you don't have to do this for everything, to determine what the relevant variables are. So in other words, if it's a particular process, what determines how much energy that uses? Is it down to production levels? Is it down to temperature? Is it down to the time of the year? Is it down to sales orders? Is it whatever? What are the variables that can affect how that particular process, that particular SEU can change? What's the current energy performance? So how is it performing at the moment? And then we need to identify those people who work under your control. So that might be staff, probably will be staff. It might be contractors, suppliers, other people working on site that you can control that may also have an influence or an effect on that process. So look at the variables, look at what we're doing currently, and identify those people who can also have an impact or can influence that. Having done all of that, we then need to determine and prioritise opportunities for improving energy performance. They can then start to become the objectives and the targets, and also to think about future energy use and also energy consumption. So in other words, where we're going, what can we see in the future? Now, this used to be a requirement in the management review. It's not detailed as a requirement in there anymore. This now seems to be in the energy review, that we have to try and forecast as best we can what our future energy usage and consumption is likely to be. The energy review isn't a once-in-a-lifetime activity. It's something that has to be reviewed and updated at defined intervals. That's for you to decide. And there's no set guidance. And it's not really like internal auditing where we say, well, you need to do it probably once a year as an absolute minimum. It's for you to decide when it needs to be done. But certainly, in response to major changes in facilities, equipment, systems, or energy using processes. So if your factory suddenly builds an annex or an extension, you get a whole new process in there, clearly your energy review needs to be revisited. And it needs to be maintained as documented information, not just the end result of the energy review, but actually how are you going to do it? So that the actual process, I don't like to use the word procedure anymore because the standard doesn't use them. It uses the term documented information, but really that's what I'm talking about. A procedure, a process map on how we carry out the energy review. And also, defining the scope and the areas that we're covering within the review. An interesting point to make, that the standard in the annex is very clear, and I'm quite disappointed by this because I was hoping that we might have got some credit for doing this, but the annex is very clear, and I'll read out what it says. The installation of a renewable energy type within the scope and boundaries of the ENMS, so you throw up some solar PV on your roof that uses that maybe feeds in 5% of your now site energy usage, does not, and I repeat, not represent an energy performance improvement. So the fact that that energy is being generated internally rather than coming in out from the outside does not, under 50,001, give you any benefit in performance improvement. A kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour, whether you've bought it over the grid, whether you've generated it yourself, it's the same. And I'm quite disappointed by that. I was hoping that you might have got some acknowledgement of that, but under the terms of this standard, which is a pure energy management standard, it's a numbers game and it's energy use. Obviously, it will give you a huge sort of relief, if you like, in 14,001, which is all about environmental impacts, but for this standard, it doesn't, and I'm quite disappointed by that. But there you go. Right, let me just see. I think there is a question that's come through. Let me just have a look. I'll come back on to the questions shortly because I've moved on from a couple of those just at the moment, so I'll come back to the questions shortly. Right, well, sorry, my fault. I've tried to scroll something and I've scrolled through the presentation itself. Right, let's just go back to where we were. So energy performance indicators are the next area that we're looking at. And energy performance indicators, KPIs, key performance indicators, again, you call them what you want. They are all about defining where you are on the journey. I think the standard defines an ENPI as a ruler that's used to compare energy performance before and after the implementation of action plans and other actions. So in other words, it's a measure. It's a measure of how well you're doing and a way of demonstrating energy performance improvement. And again, the method for determining ENPIs has to be maintained as documented information. So how you come about choosing them, how you go about updating them and measuring them and monitoring them and et cetera, all has to be documented. The energy baseline, this is the starting point. Now, rather confusingly, and I know it confused a number of people, including me, if I'm honest, when this first came out, I always think of a baseline as a set point in time. Now, actually, the baseline is a variable baseline. So it's all about establishing a point from which continual improvement can be measured, taking into account a suitable period of time. And a suitable period of time means that you account for normal operating cycles, regulatory requirements, or any other variables that can affect energy consumption, so that the data period you've picked adequately represents the full range of your performance. Usually, it's a baseline year. Doesn't matter whether it's a calendar year, a financial year, a tax year, but you'll expect to go from usually a full 12-month period. Now, the suitable period of time, one or two people I've seen reports from, I've reviewed a number of reports that have been done by some of our assessors and also looked at some clients. Sometimes when a standard is being implemented, the baseline is too close to the year that we're currently in. So as far as I'm concerned, as a guide, there needs to be one full year between the baseline and the current year for data analysis based on sort of the actual year that we're in. So therefore, we're now in 2018 September. If your baseline was 2017, you've nothing to compare it yet because we're still only partway through 2018. So sat here now, I would be very uncomfortable if somebody was presenting me with a baseline before 2016, sorry, after 2016. So 2016 baseline gives you then a chance to demonstrate 2017 and how you performed in 2017. You've got a full year to compare. The standard requires the baselines revised. So obviously the baseline isn't fixed and the baseline's changed if your performance indicators no longer reflect what you're doing. There's been major changes to the static factors. So in other words, your processes have changed, your business has changed, things have changed dramatically since the baseline was set. And also you may decide we're going to review it every few years and go back and revisit it. So what we're saying is with the baseline, if we were doing what we're doing now, when the baseline was in place, what would the baseline have looked like? So it's a little bit like working backwards to making sure that the baseline against which you measuring continual improvement is reflecting how you're currently operating. That's one of the areas that people find most confusing, and I'm quite happy to talk about that at some point. Planning for the collection of energy data, this is not really different to the whole standard, but again, that one of the thrusts of the new standard is it's much more proactive, and therefore there's a lot more about planning to do things rather than just setting out to do it. So you need to decide what you're going to measure, how you're going to measure it, and put plans in place. And the slide is fairly self-explanatory. You need to define and implement and document an energy data collection plan. So what we're going to collect, what data have we got, how are we going to measure it, what equipment are we going to use, how are we going to do that? And you need to decide what data you need to collect to monitor the key characteristics of your business's energy use. And again, a little bit of guidance at the bottom as to the sort of things that we expect to see. I'm going to skip over the next few clauses pretty quickly because really there isn't much change from the old standard other than really a change in numbering and a slight change in terminology. So competency is very similar to the existing 2011 clause, where we have to determine the competency requirements that are necessary to carry out a process and ensure that the people that we've got in place are competent, and we need to maintain competency records. Awareness, again, no real changes in the change in numbers. So anybody doing work under the organisation's control, including contractors, including people coming to work on site, have to be aware of the points shown on the bullets there, the policy, the commitments they're making, the impact they can have on your energy performance and how they can contribute. Communication, both internally and externally, you need to establish a process on what you're going to communicate, when, why, and with whom. This really comes back to your needs of interested parties. Who needs information from us? What are the expectations? How do we fulfill those expectations? One of the key areas that is a more of a specific requirement is to enable input and feedback on improvements to the management system and to our energy performance. So a suggestion scheme, some way of allowing people to give you their input, if you like, and that's an area that comes back to us within the management review. Documented information based on the 2011 version. Basically, we have to create and maintain sufficient documented information in a manner sufficient to demonstrate a suitable, adequate and effective ENMS. It's up to you what documentation you have now. There's a slide coming up in a minute that I'll show you that is the absolute bare minimum that you have to have. It requires you to focus on implementing an ENMS. We're not looking for a complex document control system. If you think back to the old days of formal quality management systems many years ago, where a document control system was huge and really complicated, we're not looking for that. You don't have to have manuals. It's entirely up to you how you set out your system, but whatever you've got has to be controlled, available as required, and protected. Now, the sad individual that I am, I've been through the standard and highlighted the areas where the word documented information appears. I've still retained the terminology documents and records, although the standard doesn't use that term, and I've tried, and it's my view, it's not necessarily the right view as to which is which. So if you can tick all of those boxes as part of in the run up to an assessment, you won't be far short of having a system that meets the requirements of the standard, and you shouldn't have anything missing when an assessor says, can you show me this, that or the other. Operational planning and control, process control. Having decided how we're going to mitigate those issues we identified at the beginning, how we're going to take advantage of the opportunities and mitigate the things that are going to hinder us, we need to put processes in place to try and make sure that we're going to do that. And that's what operational planning and control is all about. Just the same as in an environmental management system or a quality management system, we need to control the processes that are related to our significant energy uses. How do we manage them? How do we run them? How do we ensure they're running as efficiently as they can? Do we have operating instructions? Do we have procedures on how to run them? And establishing the criteria for the process. So you set the oven for this, you turn the oven on at a set time. We don't run it above a certain temperature. We switch it off when we're not using it, whatever. All of these are process control information, if you like. And making sure that the relevant people who do the work need access to and have information to that process control. So we need to ensure we've got processes established for operating and maintaining our facilities, our equipment, any systems, and our energy using processes. We need to make sure that we control any planned changes. So anything that we're going to change to our processes, anything we're going to change to the systems, we retain control and we understand what we're changing. And also we have an understanding of the consequences of unintended changes. If things change that we weren't expecting, what's that going to mean for us? And also to ensure that any outsourced significant energy uses or processes are controlled. Now, an outsourced process has been defined specifically outside of 14,001, but has been defined by the committee that manage 14,001. And an outsourced process is not a supplier. An outsourced process is where something is carried out usually on your premises, but by a third party. So for instance, one of the examples I always quote is a number of large warehousing organizations that I visit have a maintenance facility for their forklift truck. They've got that many forklift trucks that actually the company who run the forklift trucks actually have an employee based in the warehouse at all times doing that job. And that is an outsourced process. And obviously that person is still using energy within the business, so that's what we mean by making sure that those processes are controlled. A couple of clauses that haven't changed. Design for energy performance. So in other words, as we're amending processes, as we're buying or maybe looking at new equipment, as we're altering our systems, as we're altering our facilities, we have to make sure that whatever we're doing, whatever changes we make, are all taking performance, energy performance improvement in place. And to make sure that whatever those facilities, equipment, systems are, we need to look at the impact on energy performance they may have over the planned and expected operating lifetime. It's really tied in with the next clause, which is procurement. The two quite often go hand in hand. So whatever equipment we're buying to maybe look at amending a process, improving a process, changing a process, whatever, we need to evaluate the performance over the planned or expected lifetime of that kit. And what we expect, if you have a purchasing system in place for quality or even environment now, one of the commitments, one of the considerations you need to take into account when you're buying anything is that you are evaluating the purchase partly on energy performance. And if it is something that is going to have an effect on significant energy performance, if it's something related to a significant energy use, you have to communicate to your supplier that one of the evaluation criteria to be used will be energy performance. And that is something that we will check on when we're looking at purchasing decisions. As I said at the start, I like to talk, and I've gone way over my 45 minutes, and we've still got about 15 slides to go. So, and a heck of a load of questions. So I'm going to skip through these because clauses 9 and 10 haven't really altered. Performance evaluation, talking about what we need to monitor. This is now putting into operation the measurement and monitoring plan that we talked about earlier. So what we're going to be monitoring, what methods we're going to use, do we need to use calibrated or verified equipment, what are the appropriate indicators, when is it going to be done, how are we going to analyse the results, communicating the results and retaining documented information. Evaluation of compliance. Interestingly, although there's no clause on evaluation of compliance, although there's no clause on having a legal register, it's tucked away in needs of interested parties, there is a clause on making sure you're complying with it. So it's evaluating conformity with legal and other requirements, just the same as the 14,001 clause, just the same as the old clause in the old standard. And as I said at the bottom, applies equally to all legal and other requirements. Internal audit hasn't changed. Establish an audit program, and as part of the audit, you're considering the results of previous audits. You're also auditing policy commitments, objectives and targets, how we're achieving them, and above all, energy performance improvement. Management review, as I said earlier, the requirement to forecast forward-looking energy performance has been dropped. That requirement is not there anymore. It now crops up as part of the energy review. So the management review has inputs and outputs, and again, we can see there what they are, and I'll leave that there for your perusal at a later date because, as I said, the requirements are there. And then finally, the improvement clause, it's all about determining the opportunities for improvement and taking actions to make sure that our system is achieving its intended outcomes. And again, other than the dropping of the term preventive action, then the standard hasn't really changed. Reinforces the fact that we need to take a graded approach, that our response has to be appropriate to the effect or the environmental or energy impact. We need to retain documented information, the nature of the non-conformity, the actions that we've taken, the results of the actions, and then the green box has a set of requirements. One of the things that's been causing a little bit of issue with a lot of my clients who've been contacting us is ISO 50003. Some of you, and I can see that I've had this discussion with one or two people who are listening. So apologies for going over old ground, but I don't think it does any harm. So ISO 50003 isn't applicable to you as businesses or organisations. It's applicable to us as a certification body. It gives us some additional guidance as to what we do. Now, not that this is important, but it's just a little bit of contextual background. We're accredited to do what we do by UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service. That's the logo, the tick box that appears on our certificates. When they come and audit us, they audit us against the requirements of ISO 17021, which is a standard on how to audit management systems. For some reason, it was decided that that standard wasn't sufficient for energy management, and there was some additional requirements. These requirements sit in 50003, and as you see across the top, the standard is called Energy Management Systems Requirements for Bodies Providing Audit and Certification of Energy Management Systems. And it specifies these additional requirements. And these requirements include planning processes, an initial certification audit, on-site audits, auditor competency, duration of audits, and multi-site sampling. That's all in there. But the most contentious issue, and one that's received some quite harsh publicity, is the requirement for continual improvement in energy performance. Now, despite what some people claim, and I've seen a number of articles written in a number of magazines claiming, and I'm not going to mention him, but there's one particular consultant who's doing his best to stir this up. It's not a new requirement, this requirement for continual improvement in energy performance. It's not been sneaked in by the back door. It's not been brought in surreptitiously. Let me read you the opening statement in the 2011 standard in clause 1. Clause 1 is non-auditable, but it tells you what the standard is all about and why it's there. So it gives you a little bit of information about the standard, and it says, whose purpose is to enable an organisation to follow a systematic approach in achieving continual improvement in energy performance. So it's already in there, it's been in there, and it's not new. However, 50003 has caused a little bit of problem, or some problems for us and for clients. Energy performance improvement is now defined in there. Improvement in measurable results related to energy efficiency, energy use, or energy consumption compared to the energy baseline. And a major non-conformity is redefined. We have no option but to stick to this. A major non-conformity is audit evidence that energy performance was not improved. So if your ENPIs show a reduction in energy performance, that is a major non-conformance, full stop. We have no ability to work around that. Existing definitions still stay the same, significant doubt that an effective process is in place, or a number of minor NCs associated with the same requirement or issue could demonstrate a systematic failure. And it also defines a new term, ENMS effective personnel, and they're people who actively contribute to meeting ENMS requirements. So this failure to demonstrate continual improvement, at the moment it's a unique requirement for an ENMS, an energy management system. Auditors for assessment bodies must consider energy performance improvement as part of the certification decision. This also goes for stage 2, it goes for surveillance visits, it goes for recertification visits, and it most certainly goes for transition visits. And there's some examples at the bottom of what those improvements might be. We cannot, I repeat, cannot continue certification or offer certification if you are not improving your energy performance. I'll leave this information more for your information because at the moment we're not quite ready to begin the transition process. We have some training to do for our staff to complete Obviously, we have to be accredited by UCAS to the new standard before we can formally offer certificates with the UCAS logo onto the new standard. We're happy to talk about the requirements, we're happy to talk about where we're going. But basically, for those of you that have already been through the transition process for 9 and 14,001, it's going to be the same. It's not going to be the same as it was for 45,001. That was a migration, not a transition. As far as we're concerned, again, the changes to the standard are significant. When we audit, this is the way we audit in general. We do perform value-added assessments. It's not a tick box audit. It's making sure all the system's running to the benefit of yourself. As I said right at the start, all 50,001 2011 certificates expire on the 19th of August 2021. The transition audit can be carried out in 3 ways. Most people, if we follow the pattern that we did with 14,001, will have a reassessment transition. So they'll do it at the point that their existing certificate runs out. It can be done at a surveillance visit, or you can have a special transition audit done at any time. We expect that the transition also, if you have it done at a surveillance and you're one of the businesses that has a slightly longer recertification than the surveillance, it would be the same length of time as your recertification. We can carry out pre-assessments. They don't form part of the actual visit. There's no formal bearing on the certification process, and they're not used as part of the assessment, but we can come in and have a look prior to the actual visit, and that will give you an idea as to where you are. If you want to do that, speak to either the assessor or NQA sales. And that's just a little bit about the process, which is just to say there will be a gap analysis document that I'm in the middle of writing at the moment. That will be sent out fairly soon to all our 50,001 existing clients. But we will need you to have completed the gap analysis document. We will need you to have completed an internal audit against the new standard, and we will need you to have carried out a management review. So a very quick summary. 50,001 2018. It adopts the Annex SL high-level structure to ensure compatibility, almost, with other management system standards. The terminology for the energy review has been clarified. A little bit more guidance and information on the normalization of EMPIs and associated EMBs, that's energy baselines. Bit of clarification on the energy data collection plan and related requirements, and the terminology used in performance indicators and baselines has been clarified to provide a better understanding. Just have a read through that. That's sort of saying where we go next, and obviously you can't do number 8 yet because you haven't got that. But really it's a chance to have a fresh look at your management system and make sure that you are where you need to be. Right, I've gone 2 minutes over, nearly 3 minutes over. I knew I would. I am going to start ploughing through the questions now. If you need to go, I don't mind you going because we did say it would only last an hour. If you want to sit around and listen to the questions, feel free. There are a fair number, but I am going to start going through them as best I can. And if you need to drop out as you go along, I'm quite happy for you to do that. If you want to then go back and listen to the questions later, as I said, there will be a recording on YouTube. If you're leaving, thank you very much. If you want to get hold of me at any time to ask me any individual questions, you can email me, richard.walsh, W-A-L-S-H. It's richard.walsh@nqa.com. Right, so question time. Oops, why is that? Oh, there we go. So, can you give me an example of relevant requirements of relevant interested parties? I think I've sort of covered that. That was really, people might want to know your energy performance. People might want to know, certainly legislation requires you to pass on information to various people. It depends on the relationship you've got with your customers. It depends on the relationship you've got with your neighbours, your landlord, anybody who's interested. It's really about what information they may need from you in the form of energy management. Now, we're getting into some fairly technical questions, but I'll see how I go with this one. If I measure an energy use per unit produced and I have a new SKU that uses more energy, my ratio may increase despite making new SKU efficiently. Does this mean I have identified the wrong energy use metric or risk not demonstrating improvement? I suspect you've then identified the wrong energy use metric, because if you're I think by SKU you're also talking about performance indicator. If the measurement you're using starts to show that your performance is getting worse, it may be worth going back and having a look. One of the things we've managed to do where people have shown a decrease in energy performance because something's happened is to go back and say, well, actually, we think that you've got the wrong performance indicators in place, and by coming up with a more appropriate measure, you can still show a performance improvement. So I would suspect if you're not getting the results you're looking for, go back and have a look at the indicators you're using. Hi there, you note that context should be dealt with at a high level, and I agree. However, with some auditors, we have had NCs raised because they said our analysis is not sufficiently local. For example, for interested parties, they wanted to see individual contractors listed rather than broad interested party categories. I disagree with this. This is what the question says. We have so many sites, this would be I think it was off the end of the screen, a nightmare. What do you think? I agree entirely. I don't know who your assessment body is. If it's NQA, we'll address that and contact me yourself. If it's not NQA, I still think you need to take this up. We're not looking for a register that has individual contractors listed on them. If you want to go to that level, you can do, but no, I think that that's going a step too far, and I tend to agree with yourself that it becomes unmanageable. Again, the standard's all about looking at the things that matter the most, looking at the things with the biggest areas of concern. And again, I would look for your major significant interested parties on there. I'm going to hold Patrick's question, requirement to continually improve. What happens when you cannot reasonably improve anymore? I'm going to come back to that one as my finishing point. I've had a lot of discussions about this, and I've written a number of papers about this. John Swift has left. How do you rationalise your team comment? Now, he might get to hear this if he comes back to listen to the recording. How do you rationalise your team comment where the organisation is small and the team is only one person because that's all they can resource? Even one person working on their own does not work in isolation. If it's a small company, you're still going to have another person. You know, I work with a company, not on energy to be fair. I work with a company on quality where there's two people in a unit managing quality in a little engineering workshop. They work together, so there's nothing to stop the individual still referring to and involving other people within the organisation. They may not be formally set up as a team, but we're talking about collaborative working. We're not just talking about one person on their own sitting in an office and managing energy entirely on their own without consulting or involving anybody else. So team might be too strong a word, but I was using the phrase that the standard used. We've been collecting data for years. You say you disagree with the timescale of a baseline. No, I don't disagree with the timescale of a baseline. What I'm saying is you need to allow sufficient information. So you need to allow sufficient time between the baseline year and where we are now to demonstrate that you're making improvement against that baseline. So the question says, if a company has just started on the road to 50,001 2018, a good baseline, even if only 9 months of data compared to 2017. If the right AMPIs have been selected, data from the current baseline should be applicable. The problem is it depends what the variables are. If your variables particularly are set as weather, how can you demonstrate with the more extreme weather we're getting, colder winters and warmer summers, how can you demonstrate that the baseline and the improvements are there? Because don't forget, at stage 2, you have to demonstrate continual improvement, and you can only demonstrate continual improvement if you've been able to take into account all the variables. That's why I say the best practice is to have a full year between the baseline and where we currently are. I didn't say it was impossible, I just said I would be uncomfortable with it. Didn't say I disagreed with it. What would be the requirement for a type of energy use, for example, petrol, 3% of total energy use, which is not significant? Not quite sure what you're saying there about what is the type of requirement or what requirement for energy use. Yeah, you'd be expected to improve performance if you're using 50,001 for ESOS purposes. You can draw a line around it, but you would have to include petrol in your scope. You couldn't ignore your fleet, because petrol, if you're not using petrol or diesel anywhere else, it is still a fuel type, so you would still have to include it. And that's the end. So last question, if you like, the $64,000 question. Requirement to continually improve. What happens when you cannot reasonably improve anymore? I have raised this question many times. I've raised this question with UCAS. I've raised this question with the writers of the standard. I've written a paper, which I think is floating around somewhere on NQA's website, which is entitled Continual Energy Improvement. Is it perpetual? I don't believe it is. Because if we carry on improving forever, it would be a long way off, but if we continued improving forever, we will get to a point where we're doing what we're doing using no energy. And that's a physical impossibility. That is not going to happen. Also, if you're trying to make the case for additional investment in energy usage, if you draw a cost benefit graph, once the cost substantially goes above the benefit, you're going to find difficulties in getting that expenditure approved. It's a very difficult one, and I know it's putting a number of people off, if I'm honest. I'm quite disappointed that the standard has not reflected this, and also the fact that the standard specifically states that moving towards cleaner sources of fuel within your own organisation, moving towards renewables within your own site, doesn't give you any benefit at all within the system. I was hoping that that would count. So basically, at the moment, and I don't like having to say this, the answer is if you get to a point where you can't improve anymore, then you end up with a major non-conformance. And I've said that to UCAS, and UCAS, if I'm honest, haven't come back with a satisfactory answer. And I'm happy to go on record as saying that. The only answer I get is you've got to keep improving. And I know that's not possible. You know that's not possible, but we just have to try and keep working at it. And my view is that if we keep looking at our performance indicators and looking at the different variables, we may still be able to come up with a way by which we can demonstrate some type of improvement. Hope that's answered your question. That's it. The last couple of questions are one wishing me well and one saying thanks. It's been a great webinar. Thank you very much. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've gone over. I've gone nearly 14 minutes over, but I said right at the beginning I talk too much. We will be running these again. You can get hold of me via email if you want to email me something specifically. But I thank you for your time. I will modify the couple of mistakes in the slides before I get them sent out. Thank you for your time. Happy implementing, and hope I get to speak to some or all of you sometime in the near future. Thank you very much, and goodbye.